Welcome everyone to our second panel today for the Claremont Institute's Constitution Day webinars. Thanks for joining virtually. Thanks for supporting our work. And it's my pleasure to help moderate this distinguished panel here today on the topic of election fraud and the Constitution and the 2020 elections. Just wanted to say a few words about folks that help make this work possible. Here at Claremont, 98% of our revenue comes from supporters, either foundations or individuals. So we don't really sell much of anything except a few magazines, and we're in the idea spreading business, not the magazine selling business. So we're grateful to everyone who helped make that possible. First, a couple of our Constitution Day sponsors this year, Richard D. Christie and Gordon and Vashari Fell. And then our annual host committee, which helps support this event and our annual gala and a lot of our annual programming, either in Washington or New York or in California. This is a long list. It's a good problem to have a lot of host committee members, so just bear with me. It includes Thomas Mayumi Adams Family Foundation, the Burstein Law Firm, Mark D. Carlson and Susan Carlson, Richard Christie, Claremont board member Roy Crummer, Robert and Wendy DePietro, Dr. Peter Farrell, Jackie Glass and the Kling Family Foundation, Norma and Scott Granis, neighbors of mine here in Claremont, Michael and Cynthia Malone. Michael's a new board member of Claremont. Another board member, Larry Matson and his wife, Ellen Sherwood, Michael and Miriam Miller, Dr. Livia Solti Bowman, and Amy Wax and Roger B. Cohen. So thank you all for your support of our work. We couldn't do this without your help, and so we're very grateful for that. Now let's get down to business. John Eastman will kick us off. John is the founding director of the Claremont Institute's Center for Constitutional Jurisprudence. He's a board member at Claremont and a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute. He's been involved with us since almost the very beginning. John's day job, of course, is the Henry Salvatori Professor of Law and Public Service at Chapman University's Law School, the Fowler Law School. And John is doing a visiting gig this year at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Hans von Spakovsky is an authority on a wide range of issues, including civil rights, civil justice, the First Amendment, immigration, and election law, among other things. He's a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, and he's the manager of the think tank's Election Law Reform Initiative. Tara Ross is nationally recognized for expertise on the Electoral College, among other things. She'll give us a kind of longer view at the end of this panel, taking up that issue among others. She's a prolific commentator in national public prints and on national programs, and is a retired lawyer and former editor-in-chief of the Texas Review of Law and Politics. And finally, Tim Canova is a professor of law and public finance at NSU Shepherd Broad College of Law. He teaches many subjects. He has experience in private practice and public policy. He's run for office before, trying to unseat Debbie Wasserman Schultz in the Democratic Party's primary election at one point. And Tim was a colleague of John's as well at Chapman University School of Law in Orange County, where he was Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and a Professor of International Economic Law. So Tim has a class to teach at 12:45 our time, so we're going to lead off with him. But before that, I thought we'd have John Eastman tee up the issues that we're going to take up today. So with that, be sure and unmute yourself, John, which you are, and take it away.
Very good. Thanks, Ryan, and thanks to all of the supporters of the Claremont Institute, and also all of those, more than over 100, nearly coming up on 150 now, participating in this panel, and on top of the panel we just did on COVID and the Constitution. You know, I was at the American Political Science Association meeting last year, and sat in on some of the non-Claremont panels at that to hear what the left was up to, which is always fun. And they were struggling with a couple of elections that had happened. There was a congressional district race down in New Mexico that was quite clearly stolen as a result of massive amounts of absentee ballots that were suddenly found at the end of the election. And there was another one up in Ohio where they did a comprehensive post-election survey that yielded significant problems with the election. And the response from the political scientists was, we must have designed the survey wrong, because that couldn't possibly have supported the claim that there was election fraud. And they kept tweaking the design of their study until they came up with the answer that they anticipated. The notion that there's not been voter fraud, systematic, goes back quite a ways. It's been notorious in Chicago for a long time. The story of the old Politico in Boston that left in his will that he wanted to be buried in Chicago so he could continue to engage in politics has more truth to it than we would like to admit. In the 2000 election, I was one of the members of a trial team in one of the dozens of cases that had been filed in the aftermath of that contested election. And ours was the one that dealt with the mechanics of voting. And we remember from those days language like hanging chads and dimpled chads. The experts weighed in and said it's impossible to put enough pressure on a paper ballot to actually cause an indentation, to create a dimpled chad. That kind of pressure would either produce a proper vote, the chad would be completely pushed through, or it would be a hanging chad. And so we asked, how can you end up with dimpled chads? We've seen tens of thousands of them. It was only possible if somebody was stuffing 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 ballots into the machine at a time, trying to create multiple votes by a single person. And so the overwhelming evidence that there were dimpled chads was actually evidence of a systematic voter fraud effort that had been underway. Hans von Spakovsky is going to talk about those kind of issues more broadly. And then Tara will talk about the long-term consequences of taking those kind of controversies currently confined to a single county or a single state and multiplying them in every precinct, in every county, in every state in the country if we get rid of the Electoral College. But I thought it important to start first with a very particular application of these kinds of concerns that Tim Canova experienced when he ran in the Democrat primary. And I want to emphasize that. Tim and I worked together at Chapman. He was my associate dean when I was dean. And I dare say we didn't see eye to eye politically on almost any issue. But on this one, what he experienced has really been an eye-opening thing for him. So I thought I would start with him and have us describe what went on and some of the lessons he learned that we ought to take to heart more broadly. Professor Canova.
Thank you, John. Very much appreciate the invitation to speak to you today about my own experience as a candidate in South Florida. As John is well aware and everyone else knows, I'm not and have never been a professional politician, but I became a candidate for Congress in 2016. I challenged my local Congresswoman, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who I'm sure most of you have already heard of, and I challenged her in a Democratic primary in Florida's 23rd Congressional District. It was an epic David versus Goliath kind of a campaign. We were up against, at the time, Wasserman Schultz was the chair of the Democratic National Committee. We would later learn that she was busy surveilling and infiltrating our campaign almost from the beginning. We raised a lot of money because the campaign went viral, in large part because of how unpopular Wasserman Schultz had become within the Democratic Party itself. We raised almost $4 million from 209,000 donations online, which was a record at the time for most small donors for a federal office. And we put the money right back into the district. We had a huge field operation. I dare say it was probably the largest field operation for any campaign for Congress at that time. We had 4 field offices in one district. Hired more than 50 full-time campaign workers and had another 150 volunteers knocking on doors through the hot Florida summer. It was an August 30th, 2016 primary. And at the peak, we were knocking on 12,000 doors a week, calling 3,000 people a week by phone, constituents in our district, often engaging the same household several times. And when we had those voter engagements, the engagement would be input into what was called the minivan voter app database, which is part of a van voter system. So we had thousands of entries on smartphones put in by hundreds of canvassers. So it was a very large statistical sample size, larger than any polls. And it gave us a good idea where we were. And, you know, before the summer started, we were behind the one poll that was a public poll, had me down by about 10 points or so, but we were closing fast. And my field director said we really passed a tipping point by early in the summer where our field numbers had us ahead of Wasserman Schultz and surging, which wasn't too much of a surprise because, again, she had made herself so unpopular. Things started to get very strange at the end with, you could say, campaign dirty tricks. Our campaign website and fundraising platform was hacked and subject to ongoing denial of service attacks. Our lawyers contacted the FBI, and the FBI unfortunately did nothing. Even the day before the election, the local NBC6 published, well, they had on their website a preview of the next day's elections to come. And of course, all of these races, whether it's sheriff or county commission, they were all 0% precincts reporting, 0% for each candidate. But a strange thing, it had, for my race, 69% of the districts reporting, and Wasserman Schultz ahead 58-42. This was the day before the election. There were no votes that had been counted yet. We called up NBC. They took down the bogus results. We never got an explanation to this day. Our experience on the ground was that we were surging everywhere we went. It looked like we were winning and winning big, and that's what our final field numbers were showing. The polls closed on election night. The Broward Supervisor of Elections almost immediately reports that Wasserman Schultz is the winner by 13 percentage points. I did not concede the election. Almost immediately, we were contacted by election experts from around the country who were analyzing the results and were raising concerns that there were mathematical anomalies in the official results. One research team in particular conducted what was called the cumulative vote tally, where they count the numbers of votes from smallest precinct to largest. And essentially, it's a mathematical law of large numbers that the more votes you count, the more each vote should look like the ones that have already been counted. So there's lots of variation at the beginning, but sooner or later, it gets to two parallel lines the rest of the way. And it showed a flipping of the votes. We were ahead, pulling ahead, and suddenly it flips, and it diverges at a mathematically consistent angle instead of it being parallel lines. So we knew something was wrong, and I should mention that that type of anomaly in the cumulative vote tally, they also found in numerous primary victories for Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders in 2016, where Sanders was winning the exit polls. So it was an indication, according to the experts, that they thought the computer software could have been rigged, that the source codes could have been rigged against us, and that would have flipped the votes. I did go to the post-election audit. They choose one precinct in the entire county. It wasn't even in my district, so it was very meaningless. They say they pick it randomly out of a hat. I ended up putting in a public records request under Florida law to inspect the paper ballots. And I was working with lawyers and a research team. When they first approached the supervisor of elections, the notorious Brenda Snipes, we were told that there were no digital scanned images of the votes. And this was very strange. In Florida, you vote on a paper ballot. You either vote in person at an early voting site or an election day, or you vote by mail by paper ballot. But those paper ballots are not counted by hand. They are fed through an electronic scanning machine. The machines here, those electronic scanning tabulators, are designed to take a digital scanned image of the ballots. And Brenda Snipes basically said, well, we never took the digital scanned images, which seemed completely strange to everyone. But digital scanned images could be manipulated. They're digital after all. So we thought, let's put the public records, go forward with the public records request anyway, and let's see the actual paper ballots that were cast. What we had in mind was inspecting the ballots in maybe a dozen key precincts. If they matched up, no problem, but that's what the strategy was. Things, I should say, the supervisor's office stonewalled us for more than 6 months. And I finally filed a lawsuit in June of 2017. And Florida has a very good public records law. Even state constitution permits one to view public records, and ballots under all the case precedents were considered to be public records. So we filed a lawsuit in June of 2017. 3 months into the lawsuit, we filed discovery requests in which, of course, we're seeking the actual paper ballots that were cast. 3 days after our discovery request, Brenda Snipes signed an order to destroy every ballot cast in our primary, and hid that from the court, from me and my lawyers for another 2 months, which really goes to the issue of willfulness and intent under the statutes. So when we finally discovered that the ballots had been destroyed, the supervisor still did not drop the lawsuit, and we took her deposition, a sworn videotape deposition in which she admitted to destroying the ballots, basically said it was a mistake. And the judge, Judge Rag Singhal, who since then has become a federal judge, a district court judge in Fort Lauderdale, he granted a summary judgment. We got lawyers' fees, but that was the only relief we could really get. And he, in his 10-page order, he listed multiple statutes, federal and state, that Snipes had violated. Some of these statutes punishable by up to 5 years in prison. She was required by law, both state and federal law, to keep those ballots for 22 months, and she missed by a good year. When that happened, I went back and looked at our final field numbers, which really did show us winning a landslide. Those who had been identified as strongly for Wasserman Schultz combined with leaning to Wasserman Schultz were barely over 5,000, leaning to me over 8,000, strongly for me over 13,000, and about 14,000 undecided. So we could have gotten every undecided vote and we would have still been on our way to winning a victory, which was what we expected and why I had sought to actually see the ballots. When Judge Singhal granted a summary judgment, I kind of thought the floodgates would open and law enforcement would get involved. They would investigate and hopefully prosecute and start cleaning up the corruption here in South Florida. And my attorney had a 90-minute discussion with the acting U.S. attorney for South Florida, Benjamin Greenberg, at the time. We were handing the prosecutors an open and shut case on a silver platter with a ribbon tied to it. And Greenberg initially seemed very eager to prosecute, but then he went to Washington, D.C. for a week of meetings at the Justice Department, including with then Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, and comes back and suddenly there's no prosecution, no investigation, and really no adequate explanation why. We were hoping the state authorities, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement under then Governor Rick Scott, would investigate. I was told through the grapevine he was going to be running for U.S. Senate and was afraid of alienating too many constituencies by pursuing this. My lawyer, who was a very good Republican election lawyer, got back to me a couple of weeks later and said that we couldn't even count on any help from Republicans, that they had the same friends as Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the same financial backers, lobbyists, and political consultants. So, you know, economists talk about moral hazards, what happens when misconduct, illegal conduct goes unpunished or even rewarded. You can expect that it will continue. And that's essentially what happened the next time around, because by then I was already declared as a candidate to run again. I decided to run as an independent at this point. I had contacted every elected Democrat you could imagine, and nobody really was going to go out on a limb and call for election integrity here. And in my district, it's a gerrymandered district. I think it's about 40% Democrat, about 30 to 35% non-party affiliation, essentially independents, and a pretty low percentage of Republicans, about 20% or so. So we thought we had a decent chance as independents. There were no polls that were conducted this time around. Wasserman Schultz had all the money in the world to conduct polls. We had a smaller budget, and we didn't do any polls. But the Floridian Press, a Republican news outlet, reported just a few weeks before the November 2018 election that Wasserman Schultz and me were tied in a 34% to 34% dead heat. The Republican at about 13% and about almost 20% undecided. That report in the Floridian Press was sort of a green light for both Democrats and Republicans to vote for us if they wanted. Democrats wouldn't see it as a spoiler. It wasn't going to lead to a Republican victory. Republicans who were very eager to get Wasserman Schultz out of office finally suddenly thought, well, let's vote for Canova. And we saw a surge on the ground wherever we went. So we were hopeful that we could win a close three-way race at that point. But the polls closed. An hour later, the supervisor announced that Wasserman Schultz had won, that she had over 50% of the vote, and suddenly was the most popular politician in all of the state of Florida, which was rather implausible. The only thing more implausible was that I got 5% of the vote. And I didn't just get 5% of the vote throughout my district. I got 5% of the vote in every single demographic group: whites, blacks, Hispanics, males, females, Republicans, Democrats, independents, and every precinct, regardless of location or size. And those, to be capped at the same exact percentage, very low percentage for every demographic group, is what really raised a lot of eyebrows. So for instance, Dr. David Bader, then the chair of Georgia Tech School of Computational Science and Engineering, and now a distinguished professor at New Jersey Institute of Technology, concluded that those election results were mathematically impossible. He said they were as unlikely as winning the lottery every day for a year. So with that in mind, of course, we wanted to inspect the software to see if the software had been manipulated in any way. But as you'll see anywhere in this country, all the software is proprietary. Here was the private property and trade secrets of election systems and software. ES&S, which is one of the three firms dominating the electronic voting machine industry across the United States. So who is ES&S? It's a 100% wholly owned subsidiary of the McCarthy Group, a shadowy private equity firm based in Omaha, Nebraska. You can't even make this stuff up. And that's not quite the end of the story. When we lost on election day, November 2018, as the polls had just closed, one of my volunteers at Volunteer Park voting station in Plantation took video of a line of cars pulling up, offloading big blue satchels filled with ballots and loading them onto a rented truck. That video went viral, got over 2 million views within days, and it landed me back on Fox News 3 mornings in a row, where I was calling for Brenda Snipes to be fired and investigated. And suddenly people were very interested, because you might recall the race for US Senate and for Florida's governor, both, it was like a double train wreck right here in Broward County. Both races were too close to call. Brenda Snipes was either unable or unwilling to certify election results. And with each passing day, she kept finding thousands of new ballots that she claimed had been cast, but somehow had not been counted on election evening. So that did lead to the eventual firing of Brenda Snipes by Governor Scott at the time. She sued for reinstatement, and the new governor, Ron DeSantis, ended up ultimately reinstating her and allowing her to retire on a $130,000 a year pension. In January of 2019, just after this election, I filed a complaint in the U.S. House of Representatives to officially challenge the election results. You know, under the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, each House of Congress is the final judge of the qualifications and elections of its members. Yet the House Administration Committee has, to this day, not even acknowledged receiving our official challenge to that election. So, you know, Democrats like to talk about science, whether it's the science of climate change or whatever, but when it comes to empirical data, computational science, basic mathematical laws of elections, apparently they don't believe much in science. So, you know, this happened to me here in one district. It could happen, and it may be happening all over the country. It's quite easy to rig election machines. I believe it was in February of 2018, Kim Zetter in the New York Times Magazine published a big piece called The Myth of the Hacker-Proof Voting Machine. We've seen at DEF CON, the annual hackers conference, a 12-year-old hacked into the Florida election systems within something like 20 minutes. We're now told that the Department of Homeland Security is monitoring these electronic voting machines and we have nothing to worry about. I'm much less confident that that's the case. If Homeland Security is on top of the job, of course, that could explain why the Democrats have a renewed push for universal vote by mail. So, that's in long and short what happened to us. I know in 2016, law professor Frank Pasquale had published a book called The Black Box Society, The Secret Algorithms That Rule the World. And he makes no mention of the electronic voting machines. These voting machines, the electronic voting machines, have been banned all over Europe because they recognize how easy it is, how, I should say, inherently vulnerable these voting machines are to outside hacking and to inside manipulation. In the United States, we counted ballots by hand in public for 200 years. That went out the window over the past 2 decades. Here in the US, we hold on to our illusions that when we cast our ballots, when they're put through that scanning machine, that somehow it's going to be on the up and up. But, I've come to believe it's sort of like believing in Santa Claus. It feels comforting, but there's no reason to have such faith in these elections, in this election technology. I know there are a lot of liberal election integrity activists, including many who are funded by Microsoft, that claim we can monitor election systems through post-election audits of the electronic scanned ballot images, and also post-election machine recounts of the ballots themselves. But according to Ian Sancho, a longtime former Leon County, Florida election supervisor, Florida does not properly audit its vote counting machines. Sanchez has said the following: if the software is tampered with, what do you think is going to happen if you rescan the ballots, in a machine recount? You'll get the same answer back. The presumption that the voting machines is already correct is a silly presumption to begin with. It guarantees you won't find the problem if there is one. So as far as justice being done in this little corner of South Florida, there's a 4-year statute of limitations in prosecuting for ballot destruction. That means some prosecutor would have to investigate and bring charges by September 1st of 2021. Who knows if that will ever happen here. I've come away from this experience, of course, rather jaded about the prospects of fair elections when it's done electronically. I believe we should move to a system of hand-marked paper ballots that are counted by hand in public. I know people say that would be costly. It would be far less costly than these voting machines. It would require a lot of people power to count those votes. But, the more people who vote, the bigger the jury pool is of people who could count those votes. So I'm afraid I might have gone on a little bit too long, and I apologize for that. But that's what happened here in a nutshell. Thank you very much.
Tim, it's a fascinating and troubling story, to say the least. So we'll hand it over now to Hans, who's been studying fraud and other issues like this for quite a few years.
Tim, I have to say I'm not surprised by the stories you've related. I'm going to talk a little bit about more mundane forms of election fraud that have occurred in elections, but 2 points that I hope the audience understands, and unfortunately you have experienced, which is Florida has a long history of election fraud. More than a decade ago, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement actually issued a report after a long series of absentee ballot fraud cases occurred in various counties throughout the state. And a lot of people, I think, forget that the Miami Herald actually won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of an investigation of the 1997 mayor's race in Miami, but that was overturned. The court in that case estimated that at least 5,000 fraudulent absentee ballots had been submitted in that election. And I think over 60 individuals, fortunately in that case, were actually prosecuted for fraud. But one of the biggest problems we have in this country is that these cases, first of all, we don't have a lot of measures in place to prevent fraud from occurring. And second, even when there are indications of it, prosecutors all too often just aren't interested in pursuing it. And I can give you lots of examples of this. And look, we're here to talk about the Constitution today, and the only way to protect and preserve the Constitution and the liberties and freedoms that are contained in it is if we can protect something very fundamental, which is the right to vote and the ability to have secure elections that are fair and have the integrity, so that when someone wins that election, everyone is confident that actually is the person that the majority of individuals voted for. And unfortunately, we just don't seem to be there today. A couple of years ago, the Heritage Foundation started an election fraud database. We got tired of hearing people say, oh, there's no fraud in the United States, we don't need to worry about it. We're up to almost 1,300 proven cases. And by proven cases, I mean someone was convicted in a court of law, or a court ordered a new election, or a government body found a problem, like the North Carolina Board of Elections, which 2 years ago overturned a congressional race in North Carolina because of tampering with the absentee ballots that were submitted there. And as Tim, as I think you kind of outlined, look, this is not always one party stealing from another party. We have plenty of cases in our database of people within the same party stealing from each other. And that is, unfortunately, something that happens. And, you know, the news media, Reuters did it again this week, saying, oh, you know, 1,300 cases, we don't need to worry about it out of the billions cast. Well, there weren't billions of votes cast in your election in that congressional race.
That's right.
And the races all over the country, we constantly have elections where small numbers of votes can make the difference, particularly in school board elections, town council elections, county commission races, state legislatures, and even congressional races, like the one in North Carolina that got overturned, where there was only a 900 vote margin. And our cases are just the tip of the iceberg. To give you an example of how many more cases potentially are out there, the Public Interest Legal Foundation, I'm on the board, John Eastman's also on the board. They just released a report that's unique. Nothing like this has ever been done. They obtained voter registration and voter history records from almost all of the states in the United States, and they started comparing that information. They supplemented the voter registration information with other government records and going to credit agencies. So, for example, when they found a Jim Smith registered in one state, they ensured that if they found a Jim Smith registered in a second state, it was the same individual and not two different. They've just issued their report. When you total up the numbers of individuals who are recorded as having voted after they died, or the number of individuals who were registered more than once in the same state and cast more than one ballot in the same state, along with individuals who are registered in more than one state and illegally voted in more than one state in the last two federal elections, plus individuals who are illegally registered at commercial addresses, not their residences as required in every state, there's almost 144,000 potential cases of fraud that occurred in the last two federal elections. And I can guarantee you that almost none of those cases will be investigated by either election officials or prosecutors to do anything about it. And that's why we really need to be concerned about this. There's this big push right now for all mail elections. It's a very bad idea. Absentee ballots are the only kind of ballots that are voted outside the supervision of election officials and outside the observation of poll watchers. And transparency is a fundamental tenet and requirement of fair elections. What does that mean? Well, it means that voters become vulnerable in their homes to coercion and pressure by candidates and campaign staffers and party activists. And we see that in proven absentee ballot fraud cases, but it also makes those ballots subject to being stolen, altered, forged, etc. The other big problem, of course, with this is that even if you if you move aside from the potential fraud problem, if you vote through the mail, you are subject to your absentee ballot being delivered by a third party. If it's the U.S. Postal Service, you have no idea whether they're going to deliver that ballot on time. And in fact, prior elections show that you have a much higher chance of being disenfranchised if you vote through the mail. That is a constant problem. And if you live in a state that allows vote harvesting, that allows strangers to come to your door to pick up and deliver your ballot, well, then you're going to potentially have the problem that they had in that North Carolina congressional race 2 years ago, where in fact the vote harvester and his staff were obtaining voters' ballots and sometimes filling out the ballots instead of the voter filling them out, and in other cases actually tampering with the ballots and changing the votes. And that is a constant and potential danger with mail-in elections, which unfortunately we are being pushed to do. The other big problem with this area is that anytime anyone talks about reforms, common sense reforms that are intended to try to resolve many of these problems, there is a huge amount of money, unfortunately, in place to try to prevent that from happening. You talk to any American, and I don't care what party they support or what their racial or ethnic background is, and when you say to them, do you think you should have to show an ID when you show up at a polling place to vote? They all say yes. And yet if you propose that, not only is litigation filed against it, but you are falsely labeled to be a vote suppressor, which of course is just not true. We have another big problem. About a month ago, one of the U.S. attorneys in North Carolina criminally charged and indicted 19 non-citizens for registering and voting in elections in North Carolina. And that is a problem that we're finding all over the country. Again, why? Because we have an honor system. When you certify on your voter registration form that you are a U.S. citizen, election officials do absolutely nothing to check that. And yet, every time states have come forward with proposals to allow, for example, certification of citizenship by, for example, checking with the databases maintained by the Department of Homeland Security, the same way employers check with DHS, they're required to by federal law to ensure that someone is actually a U.S. citizen when they hire a new employee, or a citizen who's here legally. They are told that you just can't do that in the election area, which again is a problem. Another issue is the fact that states maintain their own voter registration databases. That's because we have a decentralized system, which is a good thing, but that makes it extremely easy for individuals to register in more than one state and illegally vote in more than one state. And for anybody who thinks that doesn't happen, I would note just one case of many out there of an individual who ran for the Democratic primary in Maryland back in 2012. Her name was Wendy Rosen. She won the primary, and she was going to be running against the incumbent congressman, Republican congressman in that district, until someone in her own party did opposition research on her and apparently discovered that she was registered and had voted in Maryland at the very same time that she was registered and was voting in Florida. Now, she was forced out of the race. She pleaded guilty to engaging in voter fraud. But the point of that story is that this wasn't discovered by election officials in Florida or Maryland, despite the fact that she had illegally voted in multiple elections. She probably could have gotten away with this for years if she had not run for office and opposition research had been done on her. So this is a problem. We need to take steps to try to prevent this. And when we discover it, it needs to be investigated and prosecuted, which unfortunately all too often is not done. I'm just going to mention two other things just briefly, which Tara and John, I think, are going to cover in greater detail. We're talking about the upcoming and current election. But of course, we will all be voting on election day for a slate of electors as part of the Electoral College. And there is this big movement afoot to get rid of the Electoral College, which is a very bad idea. The Heritage Foundation has just put out a new booklet or brochure on the essential Electoral College. It's like the Cliff Notes version of one of Tara Ross's great books on this subject. But I encourage people to look at it and just tell you this. Look, the original intent was to ensure that presidential candidates didn't just go to the big cities to look for votes. That if we had a national popular vote system, they would ignore the rural, less populated parts of the country. And one of the points we make in that booklet is that there are 6 cities in the US, the ones you would expect, LA, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Boston, Philly, that have about the same population as 14 other states. So you want to get elected president with a national popular vote system, you go to those cities, you ignore those states. And New York City alone has the same population as, or a larger population than 39 individual states. So keeping it in place today is just as important. And just finally, again, on apportionment, John Eastman and I both recently testified before the House Oversight and Reform Committee, which was holding hearings on the census. And there's been a great deal of controversy over the fact that President Trump recently issued an order, which he is both constitutionally and statutorily authorized to do, saying that illegal aliens will not be included in the population of the United States that's sent to Congress for apportionment, which is when Congress determines how many members of the House of Representatives each state has. And I don't understand why that would be controversial at all, because here's the question I would ask everyone in the audience. Do you believe that foreigners such as Russians, you know, the ones who supposedly interfered with our 2016 election, do you think they should be able to vote? Most people say no. Well, do you think Russians should be able to contribute money to federal candidates running for office? And I think most people would say no. Well, do you think foreigners, Russians, should be able to run for public office in the United States like Congress? And I think most people say, well, of course not. Well, if you believe all that, then why in the world would you think that foreigners should be included in apportionment? Apportionment distributes political power among the states. We are a federal system for the House of Representatives. And if you don't believe foreigners should vote or be able to contribute or run for office, why in the world would you think they should be included in apportionment? Particularly because that cheats states with large numbers of illegal aliens. It cheats the states that don't have illegal aliens. It cheats them out of seats in Congress. And there are a number of states, both frankly red and blue states, that should have an additional member of Congress but don't, because of the fact that we are including non-citizens, particularly large numbers of illegal aliens, in apportionment when we do that. So yeah, we have a lot of problems, some in the immediate election, but some also in future elections coming up if we make changes to our Constitution, which some folks are pushing, which would frankly damage the Constitution and our entire democratic Republican structure of government. Thanks.
Thanks, Hans. And then to close out the panel, and then we'll turn to questions. Tara Ross.
Thank you. Well, so I'm going to be a little bit more cheerful than some of what we've heard here. I didn't know some of the stories that I just heard today, and that's troubling, clearly. The good news is the Electoral College, at least when it comes to presidential elections, helps to protect us from some of these dynamics that we've been hearing about. The reason it does that is because we have a decentralized process. There is no centralized database of votes in Washington, D.C. There's no, federal commission bureaucracy that's in charge of making sure that we've got some count, the head of which is appointed by the President of the United States and gets to help the president be in charge of his own reelection. We don't do that stuff in the United States of America. In our country, we have a decentralized process where we have 51 completely different elections on election day. 51, I do know how to count states, is because Washington, D.C. does have its own election. So you've got 50 states plus D.C. Each of them conducts their own purely democratic election, as Hans mentioned, for a slate of electors. This is a statewide office. Just like when you vote for governor or you vote for any other statewide official, you are voting in a up and down vote for who's going to get to be electors for your state. Now, the good news about it being decentralized is that it makes it harder to steal the presidency. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's impossible. Nothing's impossible. We've heard that people can do all sorts of devious things, I guess, but it does make it a whole lot harder. And the reason it makes it harder is because the only way to steal a presidential election is if you have several things going for you all at the same time. One, it's a close national election. There's just a few electors separating the two presidential candidates. And the second thing that needs to be going for you is you need to have one or a handful of states that are close enough that you could steal them. And that those same states are the ones that you need to swing the electoral outcome. And then the last thing that you need to have going for you is you need to be able to predict this in advance. And that's harder than you might think. Okay, there was nobody that was saying a few hundred stolen votes in Florida is going to swing the 2000 outcome for George W. Bush. Nobody knew that. Not in advance, we didn't. Now, by contrast, if you think it is easy to predict, you could think of a scenario like Ohio in 2004, where everybody thinks that's going to be the state that's going to, and it was, but everybody knew it. And we lawyers, poll watchers, everybody descends upon the state to watch it more closely. And it is harder to steal votes in Ohio than it would be in other parts of the country. Now, you contrast that with a situation where you don't have an electoral college, then any vote stolen, I mean, you've heard some stories here, any vote stolen in any precinct in the country, no matter how easy it was to steal, will count towards the national outcome. That's what a national popular vote creates. You could have the bluest blue California precinct or the reddest red Texas one, and people would have every incentive to rack up as many votes as they could there to influence the national outcome. Because of the Electoral College, that kind of behavior is not rewarded, at least when it comes to the presidency. So, but it is, it's just kind of this situation you have where it's easy to steal votes, it doesn't really matter. Where it's hard to steal votes, it might make a big difference, but at least it's hard and everybody's watching, and you don't have to be on defense in every single precinct in the country all at the same time, which would be completely impossible. So my job here on this panel was to talk a little bit about the National Popular Vote Initiative and how that would undermine our Electoral College and this benefit that we have right now of the Electoral College. For those of you who don't know, the National Popular Vote Compact is, this has been going on for years and years. It's a group based in California. They're trying to get states to sign an interstate compact. So basically a simple contract among states. By the terms of that contract, any state that joined would agree to give its its electors to the winner of the national popular vote. Now, to date, 15 states plus DC have signed this. They have 196 electors among them. The contract goes into effect when they hit 270. So they don't have 270 right now, so it's not going to be in effect for the 2020 election. But of course, they're trying for 2024. And they made a lot of headway last year. They got several states on board, unfortunately, kind of quickly. Now, the National Popular Vote Compact would hurt, to the degree we're talking about fraud, it would hurt in a couple of different ways. One is it undermines, obviously, everything I just told you about the Electoral College and the decentralized process and how it just eliminates that altogether. The other reason that it hurts and that people don't think about so much is because it creates a system where voters all across this country are allegedly placed into one national pool of voters, but every single state has a different set of rules governing those elections. So to give you an example, right now I'm in Texas. I vote in a Texas election. My vote, if I have more time to early vote, or if it's harder to get a ballot, an absentee ballot, or any of the different things that Texas might govern for my election, I'm only voting with other Texans who are living by the same set of rules. And our votes will only affect the identity of a Texas elector. But if this National Popular Vote Compact goes into effect, that changes, because now a state like California, which has agreed to this scheme already, Californians might have less time to early vote. they might have a harder time getting an absentee ballot. There's all sorts of differences that you could have between these two elections. But then, you know, my vote in Texas can influence the identity of a Californian elector, because California has already said they're going to give their electors to the winner of the national popular vote. What this is going to create is a race to the bottom as every state tries to, you know, finagle its rules so that they can be as lenient as possible, so they can get as many of their people into the election tally as they possibly can. I have, honestly, I have suggested as a way to undermine the national popular vote plan that Texas do something like say, every Texan gets 3 votes. You get to vote 3 times for president, you know, so we can jack up the totals. And that was I mean, I said that to undermine the national popular vote plan, but also you could see where states would do this sort of thing, and it would really cause a whole lot of problems when it comes to getting an accurate tally. So that's, you know, we need to work against the national popular vote plan and keep what we've got, because it's helping us.
Thank
Very
you,
good.
Tara. Go ahead, John, if you want to.
Let me weigh in with two points. One, the first state to actually put the National Popular Vote Compact to a voter referendum is in Colorado in November. So if you're listening from Colorado, please vote no on 113. Or I'm sorry, that's political. Please consider carefully your vote on Proposition 113 to determine what should happen there. Second, I was
going to say the wording on the ballot's confusing, so maybe we could clarify that a vote for yes is if you vote yes, you're voting for the national popular vote scheme. If you vote no, you're voting for the electoral college.
Yep, good, thank you. Voter information is permissible. Let me also take up one of Hans' points earlier about illegal immigrants who are voting. As we learned in some litigation we had out in California, this is part of the result of motor voter law. When you go and get a driver's license, you're automatically registered to vote. California provided driver's licenses to illegal immigrants. And if the illegal immigrant, and there's a separate page of the form says, you know, are you going to register to vote? And you have to check off whether you're a citizen or non-citizen. And of course, if you check off you're a non-citizen, they don't process, or they're not supposed to process, the voter registration. But a lot of the illegal immigrants who were obtaining driver's licenses just wouldn't check either of those boxes. And what we learned is that the county clerks were checking, yes, you're a citizen, for them, and then registering them to vote. And we also have now learned that some people who were here on green cards and then applying for naturalization were denied their naturalization and threatened with deportation because they had fraudulently registered to vote when they weren't the one that checked the box. So this kind of thing is going on pervasively, and it's deeply troubling. Let me close before we turn it over to question and answer with just some of the constitutional process for choosing a president. Congress has set a date certain, November 3rd, first Tuesday in November, for the voting for choosing electors. With the massive amount of absentee ballots we're going to have, it's very unlikely that we're going to have the results of those election returns on election day, or even in the immediate aftermath of election day. Each state has a different set of statutory rules at what happens if they have not chosen electors by a certain date. Are there alternative provisions? For example, would the governor get to then pick the electors, or whatever? Every state has within its own statutory authorities some alternative mechanism. The second piece we have of this is the new Congress will be the one that considers the return of electoral votes that are submitted to Congress, and they'll do that on January 6th. If no president gets a majority of the electors appointed, then the determination of the presidential candidates goes to the House of Representatives, with the top 3 vote getters for president being sent to the House of Representatives. Right now, it looks like we're only going to have 2. So that scenario would only play out if the votes were evenly split. But it's significant that it only applies for electors who have been appointed. If some state secretary of state delays certification of the electors from that state. So suppose it's a state that President Trump looks like he's won, but with, you know, the excuse of, oh, we still got these absentee ballots and uncertainties and challenges going on, we're not going to certify. That would lower the threshold for the number of electors needed to obtain a majority. And it could well be that somebody then is chosen as president by the combined House and Senate in counting of the electoral votes with less than the 270 we've become accustomed to requiring. The second thing that's important is if we do have a tie, or if there are 3 candidates that divide the vote so that nobody gets a majority and it goes to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is currently in Democratic hands, and one expects it will be after the November election as well, just looking at the political dynamic. But they don't vote by pure membership. They vote by state delegation. And currently, Republicans control 26 state delegations, Democrats control 23, and one state, Pennsylvania, is equally divided. So if you're concerned about the results being thrown into the House of Representatives, as happened, say, for example, in 1824 when John Quincy Adams defeated Andrew Jackson, or when Thomas Jefferson finally prevailed over Aaron Burr in the election of 1800, if you're concerned about that, then you need to watch these congressional districts in those states where the current control one way or the other is close. So if there's a 1 vote margin by Republicans over Democrat, a flip of 1 vote in that state could change the delegation and therefore change the outcome in the House. The second piece of this is if we don't get it resolved in the House before noon on January 20th, the vice president would become president, and that one will be determined in the Senate. And again, by the new Senate, not by the outgoing Senate. And so the senatorial elections are going to be very critical, determining what the outcome in the Senate will be. And if neither the president nor the vice president is chosen by either of those processes by January 20th at noon, then the statutory act of succession means that the acting president will be designated, and that would be the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Thank you, John. Lots to chew on there. Let's hope we don't have a rolling regime crisis as of mid-November. I wanted to start with a question from Anthony, longtime friend of Claremont and fellow litigator. Why has a challenge to California-style ballot harvesting, that is, strangers being authorized to collect ballots, and the practice of automatically sending a ballot to each registered voter, not yet made its way to the Supreme Court? These practices are at least 2 years old in some counties. It seems like they have create an extremely high risk for fraud and coercion.
Well, I should say, John, there actually is a case. Arizona, the legislature there actually banned vote harvesting. It was legal in Arizona, and they banned it, and they got a very unfortunate decision from the Court of Appeals upholding the idea that if you don't allow vote harvesting, you're somehow discriminating under the Voting Rights Act, which is, of course, an absurd decision. And the Arizona Attorney General has filed a petition for cert with the U.S. Supreme Court, trying to get the Supreme Court to take this case and to hopefully overturn it and say that, of course, the state can ban vote harvesting. I think, John, I don't think that the court has decided yet whether they're going to grant that petition or not.
Yeah, well, that'll come out of the long conference at the end of the month. I will say this, the states get to decide the manner of conducting their elections. The difference between California's vote harvesting system, which basically flipped a number of congressional districts in the 2018 election because the Democrats were playing that game well and the Republicans seemed AWOL from the newly authorized vote harvesting regime. The difference between California and North Carolina, where the congressional district results were thrown out because of vote harvesting, is that the state had not allowed for vote harvesting to occur in North Carolina, and yet one of the campaigns did that. Whether the vote harvesting is itself illegal under federal law or under the federal Constitution is a new legal issue that has not been resolved, and it's not immediately clear to me what the cause of action would be. I'd like to think there should be one, but I'm not one of these guys that just say if there should be one, there must be one, and find it. But this is a new world that we're living in with these ballot harvesting schemes, and it seems to me that this is something that Congress ought to weigh in on if there's not already coverage in a federal statute that should prohibit it. But with the current Congress and the benefit going to the Democrats for this kind of machination, it would be hard to imagine such a bill getting through the current Congress.
Yeah, if I could just mention very quickly, in fact, vote harvesting used to be illegal in California. There was only a law passed that made it effective for the first time, the 2018 election. If anybody wants to understand why it should be illegal, there's actually a court decision from the 1990s in California in which an election was overturned. These were local school board elections in which vote harvesting was going on, and the vote harvesters used that opportunity to frankly engage in absentee ballot fraud when they obtained the ballots from the voters and to coerce and pressure the voters. And all you got to do is read that decision from a California court to understand why it is a bad idea to legalize vote harvesting.
What's the name of that case, Hans?
You know, off the top of my head, I don't remember, but for folks who are interested, I just published a paper at the Heritage Foundation on 4 stolen elections, and it outlines 4 absentee ballot fraud cases, and that's one of them in that paper.
Good, thanks.
But one of the other thing that's patently clear is the ballot harvesting that's going on eliminates the possibility of the secret ballot.
Yeah.
Thugs are showing up at your door demanding that you vote, watching over your shoulder while you vote, and then taking the vote to deliver. And if you withstand that pressure and vote the way they don't want you to, there's no guarantee that they're going to deliver your vote. I mean, and, you know, it's. I think we need to return to a regime that has in-person voting on paper, except for extraordinary circumstances. My work has taken me out of state on election day, or I'm ill and cannot leave my house. Those things were the reason we had absentee ballot or vote by mail in the first place. And we really need to go back to restoring that limited understanding of an absentee vote. It's a civic duty to vote. And by God, take the few minutes to go down to your local polling place and vote and help us avoid the kind of inducement for fraud that this massive voting by mail scheme now, particularly with ballot harvesting, is going to provide.
John, you began to answer Daniel's question, so let's just roll with it. From Tim's comments, it sounds like he asks, what reforms would the panel recommend and what's the prospect that they'd be adopted? It sounds like from Tim's presentation, one would be going back to paper ballots, and then from your answer just now, John, would be to restrict significantly absentee voting. Any others?
Well, I certainly recommend that an ID have to be presented both for in-person and absentee balloting. That can be done. Several states have done it. I think you should also have to provide proof of U.S. citizenship when you register to vote. And I think that there need to be systems set up that all the states participate in. California, for example, doesn't, in which states compare their statewide voter registration list to find individuals who are registered in more than one state, and most importantly, are illegally voting in more than one state.
Yeah, and I would also, I would eliminate early voting, or maybe significantly truncate it. I mean, we've now got a voting process that goes on for over a month, even 6 weeks in some jurisdictions. And a lot of the focus on the attention happens in the last few days or few weeks before that means people are voting without all of the information available to them. And it stretches out the potential for fraud, but also gamesmanship. We learned this in some of the elections in Nevada. When they'd stretched out early voting so long, you know, you can then calculate pretty accurately where those votes are coming from, having a pretty good sense of what particular precincts are leaning toward, and then you know how much more money you need to throw in to try and alter the election of what's already coming in based on the votes that have come in. It's an incentive for gamesmanship, and it's deeply troubling.
Yeah, and John, just a quick, John has the right view about early voting, and I don't think people think about this, but it's the worst possible way for voters to disenfranchise themselves. And all you have to do is look at the Super Tuesday primary that was held in early March. As you know, more than a dozen states had primaries. This was all before COVID shut down the country. And what happened one day and 2 days before the Super Tuesday primary, two of the Democratic presidential candidates dropped out. Senator Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg dropped out right before Election Day. If you look at the vote totals of states that were in Super Tuesday who have early voting, you will find literally hundreds of thousands of ballots were cast for these two candidates who were not in the race on Election Day. All of those voters wasted their vote and wasted their ballot.
I couldn't agree more with all of these suggestions. I found in my own race, so many of the ballots are cast, the mail-in balloting, like a month before Election Day.
Right.
I managed to get one debate against Wasserman Schultz, and it was about 2 weeks before Election Day. So everyone who had voted prior didn't get to see that debate. It does a disservice to the voters. There's no doubt about that. The mail-in voting here, also in South Florida, is rife with all kinds of allegations of fraud. Wasserman Schultz and really many of the incumbents have a lock on the nursing homes and the big condos. There's reports that they have relationships with corrupt insiders to do ballot harvesting for them, even to the point where there's allegations that these insiders in the nursing homes and in some of the big condos are actually filling out the ballots for senior citizens, elderly folks who don't even know they're voting. The system overall seems to me like an incumbent protection scheme. I would favor a national holiday, let people have a day off of work so that they can vote. Instead of subsidizing electronic voting machines, be paying citizens to have nonpartisan panels. You see this in other countries. When Britain just had its recent elections. I saw a photograph in the New York Times of one of their precincts where they're counting votes. And you see that there's one person from each party and they're passing the ballot across and they're each checking the box. So it's multiple checks on it. It's the safest, most verifiable, and most transparent way to hold an election is to hand count them in public.
In a pub, so they can raise a glass at the end.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I know you've got to go teach a class, so if you want to duck out whenever you'd like.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thank you, John.
Just to sort of build on this point that you've already made, John, Anthony asks, it's a good point and also a question, so I want to bring it up. Do anti-electioneering laws which prohibit ordinarily protected First Amendment activity outside of polling places retain their legitimacy and rationality in the face of expansive mail-in voting? I mean, it seems that mail-in voting changes every living room into a polling place. You can be ejected from a polling place for wearing a t-shirt, yet that same person with the same t-shirt can come to your front door, help you complete your ballot, and then collect the ballot for submission.
Yeah, that's a very good question and very good point. There's a reason we've precluded electioneering activities while you're voting. You're supposed to be able to vote your own judgment, not be pressured to vote somebody else's. The ballot harvesting scheme not only encourages, but it seems designed to allow that kind of pressure. I want to pick up on something that Tim said before he left about nursing homes. We had this experience with my wife's own father, 93-year-old father, who had was mentally incapacitated, and we had to put him in a nursing home. And because he was mentally incapacitated, we deliberately did not register him to vote because he was unaware of what was going on. We discovered that somebody else had registered him to vote and given him a sample ballot already filled out and invited him to kind of see if he could match the color in boxes that they had given him on the sample in ballot. That's a massive fraud, and it goes on in every nursing home in the country.
Yeah, that's a real problem. What about this question of a national voter ID law? What is the federal government's extent of authority, if any, for this kind of thing?
Well, that has been debated in Congress. In fact, in 2002, when Congress was writing and debating the Help America Vote Act, that's the last really comprehensive election law passed by Congress. This was in reaction to the 2000 election, and it was supposed to put in all kinds of reforms. And the bill almost came to a complete standstill because of the debate between the two sides, Democrats and Republicans. Republicans actually tried to put an ID requirement into the law. The Democrats fought it to a standstill, and that almost scuttled the entire statute. Congress has a lot of leeway with regard to federal elections for Congress, and to some extent for the presidency, and they did try to do it, but they weren't able to get it in. The only thing they were able to get into federal law, and this is the first time this has ever happened, is they did get a requirement in, and this applies everywhere in the country, that says that the first time you register to vote in a state, you have to show some form of ID. But the forms of ID are so broad that it's an almost meaningless statute, because you can use a utility bill, for example, as an ID. Well, I can manufacture a utility bill on my computer using Word or some other document. So it's a pretty weak requirement.
Sorry, I was muted. Tara, we had this question, the practical question of, if you just walk us through quickly, how would the Electoral College be abolished through this compact that's currently rolling its way through the states?
Well, it doesn't technically eliminate it. It eliminates it for all intents and purposes. It would still exist on paper. But in practice, what we would be doing is we'd be conducting a national popular election, the exact kind of election that the founders rejected at the Constitutional Convention. So, and that would just be because states holding a majority of electors would be determining how to allocate those electors based on the outcome of a national popular vote. Now, by the way, there's a lot of difficulty with that because there's no such thing as an official national popular vote. It doesn't exist. And, you have tallies that are given by secretaries of state, but, there's usually not a need to make sure you've got the exact number nailed down for that purpose, because if it's winner take all, and so if there's a 10,000 vote gap in Texas or whatever, I mean, you already know what's going to happen. And I say that because in between the first book I wrote about the Electoral College, Enlightened Democracy, in between the first edition in 2004 and the second edition, which I think was in 2012, time flies. In between those, at the back there's an appendix at the back, and it's got the tallies for all of the national elections, and the tallies were different. I mean, I don't even know who discovered what, and I don't mean just the tallies for 2000. I mean, for like the Kennedy election, the numbers were different than they had been in the first book, and I noticed it because I immediately had a heart attack that I'd gotten the appendix wrong in the first book, but I didn't. They had just literally found new votes or changed their minds. I don't even know. And so if you look at the appendix in both of those books, you'll see that there are different national tallies reported for elections that are decades old. So, and it's just because it's really hard to nail down an exact national popular vote total. But if we were conducting our presidential election on that, I mean, that just leaves you open to all sorts of lawsuits in all sorts of different places, trying to get whatever votes you can, wherever you can, to try to get those tallies changed.
And the incentive in a heavy red or a heavy blue district, where the voters are all of one party, and the local registrar of voters is of that party, and the state secretary of state is of the same party, to jack up the totals as much as they can because they think everybody else is doing that. The incentive is just perversely large. And I always say, look, just imagine having gone through the 2000 election and the controversy in Florida, imagine that kind of intense scrutiny going on in every precinct, in every county, in every state in the country after an election that is close on the national popular vote. We would not have results of the election until midway through the next year. You know, and if we were a small little bit country, you know, the rest of the world would probably survive that. It's a little hard to imagine the chaos that would be created internationally if the United States did not have leadership at the helm. I mean, it's just stunning that that people want to pursue this.
Yeah,
In 1960, this is actually why Nixon refused to contest the results in 1960. He had grounds to contest the results in Illinois and Texas, but he said it would drag the election on and on and on, and we need to have more certainty than that. Yep. So he just conceded.
Just one quick thing about the NPV, the National Popular Vote. The proponents of this claim that they don't need to get congressional approval. You know, everyone familiar with our Constitution knows that there's a provision there says that state compacts have to be approved by Congress. They claim it doesn't need to be approved by Congress because of some Supreme Court law that said that purely local compacts, you know, like when two states sign an agreement on, for example, water rights of a river that runs through two states, that doesn't affect the national government doesn't have to be approved by Congress. And so they claim, well, this is just the states doing this. The Congress doesn't have to approve it. Now, I think they're wrong about that, but what that means is I can guarantee you that if more states approve this compact and they get to the point where they've got the 270 electoral college votes, that means it's effective. There will be a big lawsuit filed, I think, by many of the states that are not in the compact. They will file a suit. It will end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is going to have to answer the question of whether this compact can go into effect without congressional approval.
And it won't be just about that. It'll also be about the equal protection claims generated by what I was talking about earlier. I mean, the National Popular Vote Compact, if it goes, and they know it's going to create chaos, by the way, the people who proposed it, they have said so. They think that the solution is to create a federal bureaucracy and a federal election code. And I mean, how do they think they're going to get non-participating states to vote for that in Congress? I don't really know, but they seem to think that's the solution. But really, their end game, but there was a question earlier, how does it eliminate the Electoral College? The compact by itself technically doesn't. It does in practice, but not technically. But the people who started the National Popular Vote Compact a long time ago, before they were getting so much attention, said that this was their end game, to eliminate the Electoral College. And they think that there will be so much chaos created by these differing sets of rules all across the country, that, and the equal protection lawsuits and all of the, the lawsuits that Hans is talking about, that we will eliminate the Electoral College just to get ourselves out of that scrape, and to make things easier. So it's a real problem.
There's another legal issue that's heading hopefully to the Supreme Court in the next couple of weeks. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court just recently decided that, contrary to the state law, that all unpostmarked or illegibly postmarked ballots received after Election Day must be counted. And I don't know, what are the chances, we got a question earlier, what are the chances the Supreme Court of the United States will accept that case? I don't know, but the notion of judges altering state election laws in anticipation of a close election, but worse, and we're going to see this as well, state judges or federal judges altering election laws after the fact, when they know which side of the scale they're putting their thumb on by those decisions. We're going to see a lot of that in the immediate aftermath of November 3rd, and I'm not looking forward to the chaos that's going to be created.
I'm hopeful.
Oh, go ahead,
I'm sorry.
No,
I'm
go ahead.
hopeful. I'm hopeful that at least for the presidential election, I know it doesn't solve the local elections, but at least for the presidential election, again, benefit of having a decentralized process where it is state by state, is there is a chance that there's just enough states where there's not a question that, the mail-in stuff, it becomes irrelevant to the final outcome. And at least for the purposes of that election, we won't have to worry so much. And it's a benefit of the Electoral College. In 2000 and 2004, you guys may remember, there was so much upset about the election in 2004, it's going to go on because, you know, we just had this, you know, whatever melodrama in 2000. So people thought there's no way this is going to be resolved on election night. I sat in so many interviews, like trying to say, well, I don't know that this is what's going to happen, because if you have a certain, you know, critical mass of states that are decided, then whatever happens to the random outlying ones is not going to matter for the presidential race. I know that doesn't address the local ones.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time, so I just want to thank you, Hans. Thank you, Tara. Thanks, John, and thank you all for joining us. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're wholly dependent, or 98% dependent on gifts from individual supporters. So if you support us, thanks so much. If you don't, please consider doing so. And if you're interested in a major gift, just email me at ryanwilliams@claremont.org. My VP of Development will be copied automatically. And thank you all for joining us. Happy Constitution Day, and thanks everybody for participating.